a deluge from the heavens, a cruel hand of fate, and the biting truth that some lives, like a forgotten letter, are simply left to drown. This is the tale of a black mail-order bride, deserted in a town consumed by the rising floodwaters, until a white ranger, a silhouette against a bruised sky, lifted her onto his horse. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The carriage wheels had churned through mud-slicked roads, each revolution a prayer whispered on the wind, carrying Elara toward a future she had meticulously, desperately woven in her mind. Her journey, spanning a continent and an ocean, had culminated not in the warm embrace of a new life, but in the chilling silence of abandonment. The town, Cedar Creek, was a cluster of weathered wood and wary eyes, already bowing under the relentless assault of the season's rains. Water, a dark, hungry beast, gnawed at the foundations of the buildings, rising with an insidious patience. She had arrived, an exotic bloom in a desolate landscape, only to find the door of her promised home barred, the windows dark, a note tacked carelessly to the splintered wood. No longer needed. The words were blunt instruments, striking her composure, shattering the fragile hope she had cradled through months of travel. Despair was a cold hand at her throat, but survival, an instinct honed by a lifetime of hardship, began to hum beneath the shock. She stood on the porch, a lone figure against the backdrop of a world dissolving into liquid chaos, the relentless drumming of rain on the eaves a mournful cadence. The town, once a distant promise, was now a trap, its inhabitants, mostly white, offering glances that ranged from indifferent to openly hostile. She was an anomaly, an unwelcome dark shadow in a place already struggling with its own light. The very air hung heavy with unspoken judgments, and the rising flood seemed to mirror the burgeoning dread in her soul. This was not the frontier dream. This was a watery grave. The rain was not just water falling. It was a deluge of forgotten promises, of shattered futures, of a life being slowly, relentlessly washed away. Her trunk, her only possession, sat beside her, a testament to a hope now cruelly mocked. The wind, a mournful lament, carried the scent of wet earth and dying hope. Her mind, a whirlwind of disbelief, grappled with the brutal reality. She was stranded, utterly alone, in a world that was rapidly turning hostile, both by nature and by human design. The water lapped higher, an unwelcome visitor, an ominous messenger, signifying the profound shift in her destiny. Each drop was a reminder of her precarious position, a symbol of the tears she refused to shed. The town itself seemed to exhale a sigh of collective indifference, leaving her to face the rising tide alone, a testament to the callousness that sometimes lurks beneath the surface of human communities. The sound of the rain was a relentless drum, beating out the rhythm of her burgeoning panic. Yet beneath it, a defiant ember still glowed, a spark of resilience forged in harder fires than this. The days that followed blurred into a grim tableau of survival. Elara sought shelter in an abandoned lean-to behind what used to be the general store, its meager roof barely deflecting the incessant rain. The water rose steadily, an unstoppable tide claiming streets, then porches, then ground floors. Food became a desperate scavenger hunt, her hunger a gnawing companion. The townspeople, few of whom remained, peered at her with a chilling mixture of fear and disdain. Their whispers, though unintelligible, carried the weight of ingrained prejudice. She was an outsider, a darky, as one drunken voice had slurred, a burden in their hour of crisis. No one offered help, no one offered a kind word. Their gazes were like stones, heavy and unyielding. The silence from the once promised husband, a Mr. Callahan, was deafening, a testament to his cowardice, a betrayal more profound than the mere absence of a roof over her head. She knew now, with a chilling certainty, that the note wasn't a mistake, but a deliberate act of rejection, likely fueled by the racial bigotry that simmered just beneath the veneer of frontier civility. She had been a commodity, a promise, then discarded. Her hands, once soft with the expectation of a new beginning, grew calloused from scraping for scraps, from bailing out the stagnant water that seeped into her makeshift shelter. The nights were a symphony of creaking wood, the lapping of water, and the chilling cries of displaced creatures, a constant reminder of the world unraveling around her. Sleep offered little respite, haunted by fragmented memories of her past, the harsh reality of her upbringing in the Reconstruction South, the desperate hope of leaving it all behind, the naive belief that a signed contract could somehow transcend the ingrained prejudices of a new land. Each morning, as the watery dawn broke, she would stand, her gaze fixed on the horizon, searching for any sign of change, any hint of rescue, but only the swollen river, a muddy serpent, continued its relentless crawl. The town, now half submerged, looked like a skeleton picked clean, the houses standing as hollowed-out monuments to lost lives and unfulfilled promises. The wind carried the stench of decay, of stagnant water and forgotten dreams, a scent that clung to her clothes, her skin, her very being. This was not simply a flood, it was a crucible, testing the limits of her endurance, stripping away every illusion she had ever held about humanity and her place within it. She was learning, with every chilling drop of rain, that hope, like the land itself, could be utterly submerged. The slow, relentless creep of the water mirrored the slow, relentless erosion of her spirit. Yet a core of defiance remained, a stubborn refusal to simply cease. The third day brought a chilling stillness, an eerie calm after the storm's initial fury. The rain had subsided, but the water level remained stubbornly high, a vast brown lake reflecting the bruised, indifferent sky. Buildings stood like half-submerged monuments, their lower windows gazing blankly into the murky depths. Ilara, shivering, wrapped herself tighter in her threadbare shawl, the damp chill permeating her bones. Hunger was a dull ache now, a constant companion she had learned to ignore. Her focus narrowed to the immediate, the desperate need for solid ground, for escape from this watery prison. She watched, her eyes narrowed, as a few scattered figures, townspeople who had managed to find higher ground, moved like ghosts among the submerged structures, their faces grim, their movements weary. Not one glance lingered on her, not one gesture of recognition. She was invisible, a piece of flotsam in the great deluge, deemed unworthy of even a passing thought. The irony was a bitter taste on her tongue. She had traveled thousands of miles for a life that was now less than nothing, left to perish while those who had claimed to offer her a future now simply averted their eyes. The silence, broken only by the mournful lapping of the water and the distant cry of a displaced bird, felt heavier than the flood itself. It was the silence of a world that had forgotten her, a silence that amplified her profound loneliness. She remembered her grandmother's words, whispered in the humid heat of a southern night. "Child, the world ain't always kind, but you gotta be harder than the stone it throws." Those words, once a comfort, now felt like a desperate plea, a challenge to a strength she wasn't sure she still possessed. The sun, a pale, watery disk, finally broke through the clouds, casting a sickly sheen on the expanse of water, highlighting the debris, the overturned furniture, the lost possessions that bobbed like grim reminders of shattered lives. But even in this desolate landscape, Ilara's gaze was drawn to the one path, the single, muddy track that led out of town to the distant, untouched hills. It was a perilous route, partly submerged, fraught with unseen dangers, but it was the only way out. Her resolve hardened, a desperate, defiant flicker in the overwhelming darkness. She would not drown here. She would not simply become another statistic in the flood's relentless tally. She would find a way, even if it meant crawling through the mud, even if it meant facing the unknown dangers that lay beyond the water's edge. The faint sound of hooves splashing in the distance, barely audible above the whisper of the water, was just another sound in the chaos, easily dismissed as the echoes of her own desperate hope. She did not yet know that salvation, or at least a new kind of confrontation, was approaching. The sound, at first, was indistinct, muffled by the pervasive dampness and the mournful symphony of the water. But then, it grew clearer, the rhythmic splash of hooves cutting through the stillness, a stark counterpoint to the gentle lapping against the submerged buildings. Ilara's head snapped up, her eyes, hollowed by hunger and fatigue, scanning the watery expanse. And then she saw him, a figure on horseback, emerging from the hazy distance, cutting a stark silhouette against the pale sky. He was not a townsperson. His attire spoke of authority, of a different world. A white ranger, clad in dusty leather and a wide-brimmed hat, his form imposing even at a distance. Hope, a dangerous, fragile thing, dared to flicker within her. But it was quickly doused by a cold wave of apprehension. What would a man like him want in this desolate place? Would he be another conduit of the town's chilling indifference, or worse, a source of new danger? Her history had taught her caution, a profound distrust of any figure of authority, particularly white men on horseback in places like this. He moved with a practiced ease, his horse navigating the submerged path with a quiet understanding, seemingly unfazed by the treacherous currents. As he drew closer, his features became clearer. A weathered face, etched with lines that spoke of sun and hardship, eyes that seemed to hold a weary knowledge. He paused, his horse churning the muddy water a few yards from her makeshift shelter, his gaze direct, unblinking. It was a gaze that held no malice, but no overt kindness either. It was simply observant, assessing, detached. The air crackled with unspoken tension, a silent standoff between two strangers at the edge of a submerged world. The silence stretched, long and uncomfortable, punctuated only by the rhythmic snort of his horse and the persistent murmur of the floodwaters. Alara felt a strange mix of defiance and desperate vulnerability. She would not beg. She would not cower. Her very presence, her continued survival, was a silent challenge to the unforgiving world that had sought to erase her. She met his gaze, her own eyes, dark and unyielding, reflecting a lifetime of battles fought and scars acquired. This was the moment of truth, the pivot point. Would he simply pass by, another ghost in the water? Or would he acknowledge her existence, her desperate plight? The suspense was a physical weight, pressing down on her, stealing the breath from her lungs. She had anticipated a confrontation of some kind, but not this silent, unsettling assessment, this wordless interrogation. The ranger himself seemed like an enigma, a man forged from the wilderness, his presence a stark contrast to the decay around them. His hand rested lightly on the pommel of his saddle, a seemingly innocuous gesture that nonetheless spoke of readiness, of power contained. The scent of wet horse and leather mixed with the earthy smell of the flood, a primal aroma that filled the air, heightening the tension. The question hung unspoken between them, thick as the humid air. What now? You alone? His voice was rough, low, unexpected in its directness, cutting through the silence like a sharp blade. It wasn't accusatory, nor was it particularly kind, just a simple query, devoid of inflection. Alara hesitated, her mind racing, weighing the risks of truth against the perils of deception. She had nothing to gain by lying, only more isolation. Yes, she finally said, her voice a reedy whisper, surprisingly hoarse from disuse. My intended, he left. The words were painful, a stark admission of her abandonment, but she forced them out, unwilling to hide the raw truth of her situation. She watched his face, searching for a flicker of sympathy, a hint of judgment, anything, but his expression remained impassive, a mask of frontier stoicism. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. His gaze swept over the submerged town, then back to her, lingering on the ragged edges of her shawl, the despair etched onto her face. No one else? He pressed, his eyes scanning the skeletal remains of the buildings around them, as if searching for hidden figures, for other survivors. Only me, she confirmed, her voice gaining a touch of weary resignation. They went to higher ground, left me. The last words were not a plea, but a statement of bitter fact, a quiet accusation against the town that had so readily discarded her. The ranger dismounted, his boots splashing into the murky water, creating ripples that spread outward, disturbing the still reflection of the sky. He was taller than she had expected, broad-shouldered, his movements economical and strong. He led his horse closer, the animal's eyes large and wary, but obedient. He stood before her, the distance between them now diminished, his presence filling the cramped space of her lean-to. Flood's not going down any time soon, he stated, his voice a low rumble. You can't stay here. The water's going to take this place eventually. It wasn't a question, but an assessment, a blunt delivery of a grim truth she already knew. He was stating the obvious, yet his words carried an undeniable weight. a practical recognition of her desperate peril that no one else had offered. She merely stared at him, her mind struggling to comprehend this sudden, unexpected intervention. Why now? Why him? What did he expect in return? Her every instinct screamed caution, survival, but a deeper, more primal part of her, long suppressed, yearned for the simple human decency he seemed to be offering. However gruffly, the silence returned, heavy with the weight of unspoken history, of racial divides, of the chasm that separated their two worlds. Yet here, in this watery desolation, a fragile bridge was being built, one word at a time, one hesitant assessment at a time. The air hummed with the electric tension of a decision poised on the brink, a pivotal moment of choice. "I have nowhere to go," Alara finally admitted, the raw vulnerability in her voice a stark contrast to her earlier defiance. It was not a whine, but a statement of fact, a stark reflection of her reality. The ranger's gaze lingered on her, his eyes unreadable. He seemed to be weighing something, a silent calculus playing out behind those weary eyes. "The road out is mostly submerged," he said, stating another grim fact. "And the hills, they're dangerous. Wolves, bears, and worse." He didn't elaborate on the worse, but his tone left little to the imagination. He was painting a stark picture of the perils that lay beyond the flooded town, reminding her that his presence, however uncertain, might be her only way out. "My post is a few miles east, on higher ground," he continued, his voice still devoid of emotion, yet carrying a faint undercurrent of practical urgency. "It's not much, just a cabin, but it's dry, safe from the water." He paused, his gaze fixed on her, waiting for her reaction. The implication was clear, unspoken. An offer of temporary refuge, a temporary reprieve from the water's relentless embrace. But what was the cost? What was his motive? Her mind, always vigilant, immediately began to construct scenarios, to anticipate betrayal. Mail-order brides, particularly black ones, were often viewed as property, as disposable. Was this a genuine act of unexpected kindness, or a more insidious form of captivity? The moral ambiguity of the situation, the desperate need for survival clashing with deeply ingrained distrust, created a palpable tension in the air. She wanted to say no, to maintain her autonomy, to refuse charity from a man whose intentions were a dark, unknown quantity. But the cold, the hunger, the relentless threat of the rising water, these were more immediate, more pressing adversaries. She looked around at the submerged world, the lean-to offering increasingly less protection, the very ground beneath her feet beginning to give way. Drowning seemed a very real, very imminent possibility. The choice, if it could even be called that, was not between good and bad, but between one unknown danger and a certain, watery demise. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the chill air burning her lungs. "And what do you expect?" she asked, her voice raspy, laced with suspicion. The question hung heavy in the air, a blunt challenge to his unspoken offer. He looked at her then, a flicker of something, perhaps surprise, perhaps a grudging respect for her directness crossing his otherwise impassive face. "Only that you don't slow me down," he replied, his voice firm. "And that you understand, this is temporary. Once the water recedes, you find your own way." It was a cold, pragmatic agreement, devoid of any romantic pretense. Yet, in its stark honesty, it offered a sliver of unexpected relief. It was a deal, not a plea, a temporary alliance forged in the crucible of mutual necessity. The ranger, Silas, as he finally introduced himself, made no grand gestures. He simply turned, mounted his horse, and then, with a curt nod, offered a hand. "Come on then, water's rising." His words were terse, a call to action more than an invitation. Alara hesitated for only a fraction of a second. Her instinct screamed caution, but her rational mind recognized the stark reality. This was her only chance. With a surge of adrenaline, she reached for his outstretched hand. His grip was firm, calloused, pulling her up with surprising strength. She settled precariously behind him on the horse, the rough wool of his jacket brushing against her face, the unfamiliar scent of leather and horse a strange comfort in the chaos. The horse, a powerful, dark-maned beast, churned through the muddy water, its hooves splashing with a rhythmic determination. Alara clung to Silas, her arms wrapped around his waist, feeling the solid warmth of his body through the layers of clothing. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of something akin to safety, however fleeting, however tenuous. As they rode away from the submerged town, a sense of grim finality settled over her. Cedar Creek, the supposed beginning of her new life, was now merely a watery grave for her hopes, a testament to the callous indifference of man and nature. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the rhythmic splash of hooves and the distant, mournful cry of a displaced bird. She risked a glance back, seeing the roofs of houses disappearing beneath the murky expanse, feeling a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a distant, tragic play. The past was now truly behind her, swallowed by the flood, leaving her with an uncertain present and a blank, frightening future. She focused on the steady rise and fall of Silas's chest, the subtle shifts of his weight in the saddle, finding a strange comfort in the tangible reality of his presence. He was a stranger, a man whose motives remained shrouded in ambiguity, but for this moment, he was her unlikely anchor in a world turned fluid. The ride was slow, laborious, through treacherous currents and unseen debris. Every now and then, Silas would expertly guide the horse around a submerged obstacle, his vigilance a silent reassurance. The sky, still bruised and heavy, threatened more rain. But for now, the air was mercifully still. The world outside the immediate sphere of the horse felt distant, an indistinct blur of water and muted colors. She was a passenger on this desperate journey, surrendering her fate to the hands of a man she knew nothing about, a man who had emerged from the heart of the storm to offer an unexpected, unsettling salvation. This moment, clinging to the back of a stranger's horse, was not a rescue in the traditional sense, but a raw, desperate act of survival, a bridge over troubled waters leading to a destiny still unknown. The unspoken questions between them about who they were, why they were here, and what would come next, hung heavy in the air, a subtle tension that underlay the desperate quietude of their escape. Hours later, the horse, weary but persistent, finally found purchase on higher ground. The ranger's cabin was a rough-hewn structure, isolated, nestled among a cluster of towering pines, its chimney emitting a faint curl of smoke that promised warmth. It was a stark contrast to the watery desolation they had left behind. Silas dismounted first, his movements stiff, then offered a hand to Alara, helping her slide down. Her legs, unaccustomed to such prolonged stillness, wobbled beneath her, and she nearly stumbled. He steadied her with a firm grip on her arm, his touch brief, purely practical. "Come on," he grunted, leading the way to the cabin door. Inside, a small fire crackled in a stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the cramped room. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and something metallic, perhaps from his tools. It was a humble dwelling, a single room containing a cot, a rough-hewn table, and a few basic necessities. It was not a home, but it was dry, and blessedly, it was solid. Ilara sank onto the cot, her body protesting with aches and shivers, the lingering chill of the flood still clinging to her. Silas moved with quiet efficiency, placing a kettle on the fire, his back to her, his silence a constant presence. He was an enigma, a man of few words, his actions speaking volumes. He offered her a tin cup of hot, bitter coffee, its warmth seeping into her chilled fingers, a small comfort in the overwhelming desolation. The warmth of the fire, the simple act of holding a hot cup, seemed to thaw something deep within her, a frozen knot of fear and exhaustion. She watched him, his profile illuminated by the flickering firelight, trying to discern the man beneath the ranger's uniform, the human beneath the stoic exterior. He was a product of this harsh land, resilient and self-sufficient, but also, perhaps, burdened by its isolation. The silence stretched between them, a weighty thing. Yet it was not entirely uncomfortable. It was a space for reflection, for the slow, painful processing of the day's brutal events. Her eyes drifted around the small cabin, noting the few personal items. A well-worn book on a shelf, a faded photograph tucked into a wooden frame she couldn't quite make out. These were small windows into his life, fragments of a story she could only guess at. He was not merely a rescuer. He was a man with his own past, his own burdens, his own reasons for being out here, alone. The flickering firelight cast long, shifting shadows, distorting the familiar into something strange and new, a perfect metaphor for the unsettling shift in her own existence. The air itself seemed to hum with the quiet intensity of two disparate lives suddenly, dramatically intertwined. Days blurred into a routine dictated by the ranger's habits and the slow, agonizing recession of the floodwaters. Silas, a creature of few words, kept mostly to himself, occupying his time with mending equipment, cleaning his rifle, or simply staring out at the still sodden landscape. He never offered explicit comfort, never asked about her past, yet his presence was a constant, unsettling reassurance. He shared his meager rations without complaint, always ensuring she ate, though his meals were as sparse as his conversation. Alara, in turn, retreated into herself, a silent observer of this strange, temporary alliance. She helped where she could, cleaning, gathering, kindling, but mostly she watched, her gaze following Silas's movements, trying to decipher the unsaid things that hung in the air between them. The initial tension of her suspicion began to slowly fray, replaced by a grudging curiosity. She learned he was a federal ranger, tasked with patrolling these remote lands, a lonely, often thankless job. He had seen much, his eyes holding the weight of countless unseen burdens. There were times, late at night, when she would hear him stirring, or catch him staring into the embers of the fire, his face etched with a profound weariness, a distant sorrow she couldn't quite place. It was in these moments that his stoic facade seemed to crack, revealing glimpses of a deeply flawed, emotionally complex man, far removed from the stereotypical societal figures she had encountered. One evening, as the rain finally ceased entirely, leaving behind a world sparkling with wet clarity, he spoke of the flood, not with anger, but with a grounded resignation. "Seen worse," he murmured, his voice low, "but this one's got a mean streak. Takes what it wants, leaves what it doesn't." His words were heavy, laden with a poetic undertone that surprised her, a stark reflection of the land's unforgiving nature. She listened, absorbing his pragmatic acceptance, feeling a strange connection to this man who articulated the harsh realities of their shared existence without sentimentality. He rarely asked about her, but his quiet observation spoke volumes. He noticed the way her hands trembled, the haunted look in her eyes. He never commented, but his actions, the careful placement of an extra blanket by her cot, the slightly larger portion of stew, were subtle yet clear acknowledgments of her distress. The irony of her situation was not lost on her. Abandoned by those who should have protected her, she found a strange, precarious safety with a man who, by all societal conventions, should have been her antagonist. This period of forced cohabitation was a slow burn, a gradual unveiling of truths, not through dramatic revelations, but through the quiet rhythm of shared survival. The cabin, once a mere shelter, became a space where assumptions were slowly, imperceptibly, chipped away, revealing the raw, unvarnished humanity beneath. The water, though slowly receding, left behind a landscape of desolation and mud, a vast canvas of ruin. The roads remained impassable, transformed into treacherous quagmires, and the townsfolk, those who had fled to higher ground, were still nowhere to be seen. Alara's time in Silas's cabin stretched, a forced reprieve that blurred the lines of her original purpose. She began to notice the subtle rhythms of the wilderness, the calls of unseen birds, the distant howl of coyotes. She watched Silas, his movements economical and precise, as he moved through the cabin, a silent sentinel against the world's indifference. He never intruded upon her thoughts, but his presence, grounded and solid, allowed her to grapple with the enormity of her abandonment. One afternoon, as she helped him clean a stubbornly rusted trap, she saw the faint scar tracing his jawline, a thin white line against his weathered skin. It was a small detail, but it hinted at a past as complex and possibly as violent as her own. She almost asked about it, but the words caught in her throat. The silence between them was not empty, but filled with unspoken narratives, with the heavy weight of separate, painful histories. He, too, seemed to carry a burden, a quiet melancholy that settled around him like a second skin. He would often stare out the window, his gaze distant, lost in some unseen memory, and in those moments he seemed less a ranger, more a man haunted by the vast emptiness of the frontier. The isolation, though initially frightening, also offered a strange kind of freedom, away from the judgmental eyes of society, the strictures of race and expectation. She found a raw, unvarnished sense of self emerging. She was not a mail-order bride, not an unwanted commodity. She was simply Elara, a survivor. The cabin, small and rudimentary, became a cocoon, sheltering them from the harsh realities of the outside world, allowing a subtle, unspoken understanding to develop between them. It was a space where the usual societal rules seemed suspended, replaced by the fundamental truths of shared vulnerability and mutual, if unspoken, respect. The irony was palpable. She had journeyed so far seeking a new life built on conventional promises, only to find a truer connection, a more authentic sense of self, in the desolate aftermath of betrayal, with a man who represented everything society dictated she should distrust. The air, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, resonated with the quiet intensity of their shared existence, a bond forged not by words, but by the stark, undeniable truth of survival. This was a space of quiet revelation, a fragile pause in the relentless drama of her life, where the deepest flaws of humanity were confronted by its unexpected capacity for resilience and connection. The morning Silas announced his intention to ride out, to survey the full extent of the flood damage, and perhaps seek out other survivors. A cold dread settled in Alara's stomach. The world outside the cabin still felt treacherous, unknown. "I'll be back by nightfall," he stated, his voice flat, his gaze unwavering as he met her anxious eyes. It was not a question of her comfort, but a simple declaration. She nodded, unable to speak, the unspoken fear of being left alone, once again, a suffocating presence. As he prepared his horse, packing a meager saddlebag, he paused, his back to her. "There's a small stream behind the cabin," he said, his voice softer than usual, almost a murmur. "Clear water, and a small patch of berries, not much but enough." It was a rare moment of direct care, a subtle instruction for her survival in his absence. He did not turn to face her, allowing the words to hang in the air, a practical gesture that conveyed more than any flowery sentiment. And then he was gone, a solitary figure disappearing into the vast, waterlogged wilderness, leaving her alone in the quiet cabin, the silence suddenly deafening. The hours crawled by, each minute stretching into an eternity. The cabin, once a haven, now felt like a prison. She tried to busy herself, cleaning, tending the fire, but her mind was a whirlwind of anxieties. The old fears, those of abandonment and vulnerability, resurfaced with a chilling intensity. She found herself peering out the small, grimy window, her eyes straining against the fading light, searching for any sign of his return. Every creak of the wind, every rustle in the trees, sent a jolt of panic through her. The wilderness, previously a distant threat, now pressed in on all sides, its vastness embodying the terrifying scale of her solitude. She remembered her grandmother's superstitions, the warnings against venturing out alone after dark, the spirits that lurked in the shadows. The primal fear was raw, untamed. As the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into a deep, oppressive twilight, her heart pounded against her ribs. The silence of the cabin was no longer comforting, but a suffocating shroud, amplifying the sound of her own ragged breathing. She huddled by the fire, its dwindling flames offering scant comfort against the encroaching darkness. Had he been injured? Had he simply chosen not to return? The thought, though cruel, was a familiar sting. She was once again the discarded one, a life deemed unworthy of rescue. This long night of waiting was a crucible, forcing her to confront her deepest fears, revealing the fragile hope she had, perhaps unconsciously, placed in this taciturn ranger. The darkness outside the cabin was absolute, a profound emptiness that seemed to mirror the fear blossoming within her. She was adrift, a fragile boat in a sea of overwhelming uncertainty, the silence of the night echoing the desolate quiet of her own heart. The air itself seemed to hum with the lingering tension of unspoken words, of a fate held precariously in the balance. Just as despair began to curl its icy fingers around her heart, a faint splash, then another, broke the suffocating silence. Elara's head snapped up, her eyes wide, straining against the darkness beyond the window. The sounds grew clearer, the unmistakable rhythm of a horse's hooves churning through mud and shallow water. A wave of profound relief, so potent it left her breathless, washed over her. He was back. A minute later, Silas materialized from the inky blackness, a weary silhouette leading his equally weary horse. He didn't offer an explanation for his slight delay, nor did he make a fuss. He simply dismounted, his movements stiff, and began to tend to his horse with the quiet efficiency that was his hallmark. Ilara watched him, a knot of emotion tightening in her throat. The sheer relief of his return, coupled with a deep, unacknowledged gratitude, was almost overwhelming. She realized, with a startling clarity, how much she had come to rely on his grounded presence, how much his silent, unspoken protection had meant in these harrowing days. As he entered the cabin, shedding his damp coat, his gaze met hers for a fleeting moment. There was no apology, no reassurance, just a brief, almost imperceptible flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps acknowledgement, perhaps a shared understanding of the night's unspoken anxieties. He simply nodded toward the fire. "Hungry?" he grunted, already moving to tend to the dying embers. It was a mundane question, a simple offer of sustenance, yet it carried the weight of unspoken care, a subtle reaffirmation of their shared existence. The act of sharing food, of simply being present in the same space, felt like a powerful ritual, a testament to the fragile bond that had formed between them. The tension in the cabin eased, replaced by the quiet hum of the rekindled fire and the comforting sounds of his movements. Ilara, for the first time in days, felt the tightness in her chest loosen. The oppressive weight of fear began to lift. She watched him, a man of profound contradictions, outwardly detached, yet possessing a quiet, unassuming capacity for care. He was not the hero of a grand tale, but a man of the frontier, scarred and complex, yet undeniably, remarkably, here. His return was not a dramatic climax, but a grounded, real moment of profound reassurance, a quiet declaration that she was not, after all, truly alone. The cabin, once a mere shelter, now felt like a refuge, a tiny island of human connection in the vast, indifferent expanse of a world still reeling from catastrophe. In the flickering firelight, the unspoken truths of their shared vulnerability and the unexpected comfort of human presence hung in the air, a palpable sense of renewed, fragile hope. The true emotional climax of their story did not arrive with a flash of lightning or a roaring crescendo, but with the quiet, devastating clarity of a single conversation. Weeks had passed. The floodwaters had receded enough for the first weary townspeople to begin their slow, painful return, their faces etched with the twin tolls of loss and resentment. Silas, though his duty demanded his presence in the town, still returned to the cabin each night, a silent anchor in Ilara's increasingly complicated world. One evening, he returned later than usual, his jaw tight, his eyes shadowed. He moved about the cabin with an agitated energy, a stark contrast to his usual placidity. Ilara, sensing the shift, remained silent, waiting. Finally, he turned to her, his voice rougher than usual. "They've seen you here," he stated, his gaze direct, unyielding. "The Callahans, and others, they know you're still here." The words hung heavy in the air, weighted with unspoken threat. Ilara felt a chill, colder than any floodwater, seep into her bones. The town, with its ingrained prejudices, was reasserting its claim, its collective animosity, a tangible presence even from miles away. "They don't want you in Cedar Creek," Silas continued, his voice lowering, almost a whisper. Not after what they think happened." He didn't need to elaborate. The insidious rumors, the racial bigotry, the convenient scapegoating, it all coalesced into a single, ugly truth. They blamed her, the black woman, the outsider, for the town's misfortunes, for the shame of their own abandonment. They say I should send you away," he admitted, his gaze finally faltering, dropping to the floor. The admission was raw, stripped of his usual stoicism. It was a direct challenge to the fragile, unspoken bond that had formed between them. Ilara felt her breath catch in her throat. This was it, the moment she had subconsciously prepared for, the inevitable re-entry of the world's harsh realities. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the sudden, terrifying silence. But then, Silas raised his head, his eyes meeting hers again, and in their depths she saw not cold calculation, but a profound weariness, a struggle. "But I won't," he declared, his voice firming, a quiet defiance resonating in the small cabin. "It ain't right. You didn't do nothing to them." The words were simple, unadorned, but they struck her with the force of a physical blow. He was choosing her. He was choosing to stand against the ingrained prejudices of his own community, his own race, for her. It was a choice born not of romance, but of a deeper, more grounded morality, a quiet act of courage that defied a lifetime of expectation. This was the true climax, the raw, emotional heart of their journey, a silent, profound understanding passing between two deeply flawed, morally ambiguous individuals, forging an unbreakable bond in the face of societal hatred. The air crackled with the weight of that choice, the reverberations of his quiet declaration shaking the foundations of her world. The choice, once made, was a silent covenant between them, understood without further words. Silas continued his patrols, now with a heightened vigilance, his presence a shield against the creeping hostility from Cedar Creek. Ilara, no longer simply a survivor, became a quiet sentinel of the cabin, observing the subtle shifts in the landscape, the slow, agonizing process of the world healing from the flood. The townspeople, though unseen, remained a brooding presence, their judgment a distant, palpable pressure. Yet, within the confines of the cabin, a tentative new reality began to form. Their interactions, still sparse in dialogue, were rich with subtext. Each shared glance, each quiet gesture, imbued with meaning. He would leave her small carvings on the table, a smoothed river stone, a bird feather, silent acknowledgments of her presence, of a shared understanding that transcended words. She, in turn, would ensure his meager meals were warm, his small space tidied, small acts of reciprocal care. There was no declaration of love, no grand romantic gestures. Their connection was forged in the crucible of shared adversity, a deep, grounded empathy born of mutual vulnerability. Ilara often found herself reflecting on the irony of it all. She, a black woman fleeing the injustices of the South, finding her unexpected sanctuary not in the arms of a promised husband, but in the quiet, resolute presence of a white ranger, a man who, by all societal expectations, should have been her oppressor. The hope she had arrived with, once shattered, began to reform, not into the shape of a conventional dream, but into something more resilient, more authentic. It was a hope born of quiet strength, of human connection forged in the crucible of shared struggle. The world outside remained fraught with danger, with prejudice, but within the small, warm circle of the cabin, a different kind of future began to germinate, slow and steady, like a seed pushing through hard earth. The cabin, once a temporary refuge, had become a quiet testament to defiance, a subtle rebellion against a world that sought to divide and destroy. The narrative had come full circle, from the devastating climax of abandonment to a tentative, hopeful resolution, where shared humanity triumphed over the destructive forces of nature and societal bias. Their bond was not flashy, but deeply rooted, a testament to the quiet strength of two souls finding unexpected solace in each other, against all odds, in the heart of a broken world. The sun, when it finally broke through the perpetual cloud cover, felt like a blessing, warm on her skin, a promise of new beginnings, not the ones she had once sought, but ones far more profound and real. The spring arrived, tentative at first, then bursting forth with a defiant vigor, washing away the last visible scars of the flood. The ground hardened, the roads began to dry, and the world outside the cabin slowly, painfully, returned to a semblance of order. With the receding waters, the path to a new life, however uncertain, finally became clear. Ilara knew, with a quiet certainty, that her time at the cabin was drawing to a close. Silas, too, recognized the shift, his movements growing subtly more distant, more purposeful. He was a man of the wilderness, and his duties called him to ranges far beyond the small, sheltered valley they had shared. There was no grand farewell, no dramatic parting words. Their bond, forged in silence and shared struggle, did not require them. One morning, as the sun climbed high, casting long, golden shadows across the now dry landscape. Alara stood by the cabin door, her meager belongings once again packed into her trunk. Silas stood by his horse, reins in hand, his gaze sweeping the horizon. He turned to her then, his eyes meeting hers, and in their depths she saw a flicker of unspoken understanding, a recognition of their shared journey. "Be safe," he said, his voice low, rough, but carrying an unmistakable weight. It was a simple phrase, yet it encompassed all the complex emotions that had woven through their time together. It was a blessing, a warning, a quiet expression of care. Alara nodded, her own voice caught in her throat. She understood. Their paths diverged here, but the imprint of their shared experience would remain. She would carry the lessons learned, the resilience forged, the quiet strength found in the presence of this morally ambiguous, unexpectedly kind man. As she began her journey, walking away from the cabin and the man who had offered her unlikely sanctuary, she did not look back. The past was behind her, swallowed by the flood, and reborn in the quiet crucible of survival. The future was unwritten, fraught with its own challenges, but she stepped into it with a newfound resolve, a quiet strength born of knowing that even in the darkest of times, hope could emerge from the most unexpected places. The horizon, once a distant, intimidating line, now beckoned, not as a promise of conventional happiness, but as an open road, a testament to her own enduring spirit, a journey towards a destiny shaped not by societal contracts, but by the indomitable will of a woman who refused to drown. The wind, once a mournful lament, now felt like a whisper of possibility, carrying her forward, leaving the lingering shadow of the past behind, and embracing the vast, uncertain beauty of her own, unfolding narrative.